Also, our YouTube channel is being activated right now. Yeah, thank you, Bob. I just saw that. So we still have a minute or so for people to come in. If they can come in here, they don't get stuck in the Zoom gate. I'd say, Todd, we're still giving it a minute or so since I see people still logging on. It's not quite 11 o'clock here yet, just one more minute. Yeah, they're coming in.
So honey, I put that against the door because it rattles. I'll do it. I'll do it again before we start. Did you send me a link? I did.
So one more minute or 30 seconds before we start here. So I would say it's 11 o'clock here now. So welcome everyone in Germany, in Stuttgart, and everywhere else in Germany, and here in St. Louis. Welcome to our virtual lecture series. Before we officially start, I would like to walk everyone through our technical setup today. This lecture will be recorded, and a link to this recording will be provided later on our website as well. Our Zoom settings for today are as follows. During the presentation, all our guests will remain muted. This means our audience cannot switch on their microphones. Faces visible on your screen will be just the speakers' faces and your own face if you happen to switch on your own camera. But in other words, guests will not be able to see each other this time. Everyone will be able to submit questions at any point of time during the presentation. Please feel free and much invited to share your names and organization in the chat box, which you find on the bottom of your screen right in the middle. Next to that chat box, also on the bottom, so also auf der unteren Menüleiste auf Ihrem Bildschirm, you will find the Q&A button. Please use the Q&A button for submitting your questions. As for time, we plan on about 30 to 40 minutes of presentation, followed by a question and answer session. We plan to wrap it up around 7:30 Germany time and 12:30 here local St. Louis time. On behalf of the University of Missouri St. Louis, also called UMSL, 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 I would like to take the opportunity to thank the City of Stuttgart for their generous sponsorship of this lecture series as part of our sister cities anniversary celebrations, 60 years of Stuttgart and St. Louis. I would like to thank our sister city committees on both sides of the Atlantic, as much as I would like to acknowledge the support of the German Culture Center at UMSL and the DAZ, the Deutsch-Amerikanische Zentrum in Stuttgart. My name is Liane Konstantin. I'm the Interim Executive Director of UMSL Global, which is the international office of our university here. Today, I'm also here as a representative of our Stuttgart-St. Louis Sister City Board that has been strongly involved in making our 60th anniversary of city partnerships a year-long event of exchange celebrations. I'm originally from Germany. I've worked for the German government and for the DAD for many years before moving to the United States 8 years ago, and I've been with AMSL for 4 years. We are a public research university, and for our German guests here tonight, it might be important to know that the large public research institutions in the United States oftentimes see a relatively high percentage of so-called minority students, which is the term used to describe students of color. In this series of our events, you will see how this is relevant and important to us. Today, I will serve as your moderator and, if at all needed, as your cultural translator. This lecture series on race and racism is the result of an invitation of the city of Stuttgart looking to facilitate a transatlantic discussion steered by academic and career experts of this field. Our university has welcomed this opportunity, and we are excited about this lecture series, which intends to provide lots of opportunity for questions, discussion, and intercultural learning. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker to you, Professor Dr. Todd Swanstrom. Todd Swanstrom is an endowed professor and graduate director of the Department of Political Science here at AMSL at the University of Missouri St. Louis. Professor Swanstrom hat also einen unserer bedeutendsten Stiftungslehrstühle inne, das heißt also eine Endowed Professorship, der in diesem Fall ganz besonders die lokale Community-Arbeit unterstützt, bei der AMSL einen sehr wichtigen Platz in St. Louis einnimmt. As such an endowed professor, and through the so-called Desmond Lee Professorship of Community Collaboration and Public Policy Administration at AMSL, Professor Swanstrom specializes in urban politics and public policies. Todd Swanstrom holds a PhD from Princeton University, and he's the co-author of a book called Place Matters: Metropolitics for the 21st Century. Todd Swanstrom is also not a newcomer to Germany. So last year, Todd's students collaborated with students from Technische Universität in Dortmund, Germany, to win a competition called The Future of My City. They won with their report on comparing gentrification in Dortmund and St. Louis. This awarded project was part of Germany's Wunderbar Together campaign that featured German-American friendship and ties all over the United States and was initiated by the German government. Todd has used the resources of his endowed professorship to support a network of community development organizations in St. Louis and to develop the anchor mission of the university to lift up the communities around our campus. Todd has also instructed me to keep instructions short. So I think I will finally comply, and for the sake of friendship, and I will hand over to you, Todd. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Leanne, for the generous introduction. And we're so lucky to have somebody like you who's fluent in German to coordinate this exchange with Stuttgart. I'm going to begin with a test for our listeners. That's what professors do, right? They give tests. So this is a three-question test. And I'm not going to grade it. You have to grade yourselves here. But what do you call someone who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual, right? What do you call someone who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who speaks 1 language? An American. So I just want to underscore how grateful we are that the residents of Stuttgart are able to participate in the English language and to facilitate this exchange. So thank you for your language ability and flexibility. Leanne asked me to say a few words about how I got interested in the topic of race and urban policy. It's a kind of interesting, quick story here. Over 40 years ago, I was a student of political theory at Princeton University, trying to come up with a dissertation topic, and every topic kind of went like this when it's supposed to go like this, right? It's supposed to become more focused. I was driving a taxi in New York City, organizing in the Taxi Drivers Union, and I ran into a friend, and we started talking about this interesting mayor in Cleveland, Ohio. And he asked me at one point, would I like to write an article comparing the mayor of Cleveland to the mayor of New York? And so we wrote that article and we published it in the Nation magazine. And soon afterward, I said to myself, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to write my PhD dissertation on this very intriguing political leader and experiment in urban populism in Cleveland? So I wrote a letter to the mayor of Cleveland. And to my surprise, about a week later, I got a phone call from his top lieutenant who offered me a job in Cleveland. And I got in my Volkswagen, the well-known Volkswagen, which was what all poor students drove back in those days, and drove out to Cleveland, got an apartment on the west side of Cleveland in a pretty poor neighborhood, and worked as a neighborhood planner in Cleveland. And when I was a neighborhood planner in Cleveland, I would see large swaths of the East Side, which is the largely African-American community, where housing was being abandoned and demolished and torn down. And I was just shocked by this. I could not figure out why perfectly good housing would be torn down. What is going on here, and why was it happening predominantly in the Black community? And basically for the past 42 years, I've been trying to answer that question, right? I wrote my dissertation on Cleveland, published it as a book, and still puzzling on these issues. So that's how I got interested in this topic. And I want to say right away, I'm obviously white. So I cannot speak to the experience of Black Americans. There's obviously issues with whites talking about the Black experience. What I can base my talk on is 42 years of working in cities, doing community organizing, doing research, teaching, and writing about urban issues. As Leon mentioned, for the past 12 years, I've had this endowed position at UMSL, and I've used it to work in the community development arena in St. Louis, in low-income and minority neighborhoods in the region, and reflected on that experience in order to address these issues. I think we're all familiar that in the recent election, urban issues and suburban issues and race played a prominent role. Here is a quote from Donald Trump in the recent election. I'm sure many of you have heard what he said, but I'm happy to inform all of the people living in their suburban lifestyle dream that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood. Your housing prices will go up based on the market and crime will go down. I have rescinded the Obama-Biden AFFH rule. Enjoy. There's a number of other quotes by Trump in which he is reaching out to suburban women, especially, to protect their neighborhoods and criticizing Democratic-run cities. The AFFH rule that he refers to there is affirmatively furthering fair housing. And that was an initiative that was started by the Obama administration to require localities to examine their policies, not just to say, are you preventing people from discriminating against someone because of the color of their skin, but are you going further and examining the public policies which are maintaining and in some cases worsening segregation, which could be things like zoning laws, which prohibit people from being able to move into new communities and follow the jobs. It could be where you build the highway or where you build the convention center and where you force people out of their homes. It's a whole set of policies they were asking. The Trump administration basically did away with this, right? And Trump is saying he's protecting the suburbs from all of this low-income housing. Donald Trump also ran against the Black Lives Matter movement, right? The idea that we need to hold police more accountable. And this grew out of something that I have a feeling even our European brothers and sisters are familiar with, which is Ferguson. Happened about 6 years ago. Here is a map of the St. Louis metropolitan area and St. Louis City and County. You can see down the center here is the Mississippi River. You need to understand this geography because my talk is all about place. It's all about the geography. So here's the Mississippi River. Here's the border of the city of St. Louis. St. Louis is a fairly small city in the context of the entire region. And here's Ferguson, right? Ferguson is an inner ring suburb, which not too far from the city border, as you can see there, not too far from the city border. And Ferguson, of course, is where you had a horrible tragedy back in 2014, the shooting of Michael Brown, the shooting of an unarmed Black teenager by a white police officer, Darren Wilson. Michael Brown's body lay in the street in Ferguson for 4 hours. As the community became more and more disturbed, there were demonstrations that occurred right after the crime, and then the prosecutor in St. Louis refused to indict the white police officer. So the white police officer was not disciplined for this action. And following that, there were riots and demonstrations, some violent, most of them nonviolent, but very, very, very energetic. And we had the Ferguson moment, right? It sparked a national and even an international protest movement, which now, of course, in the recent George Floyd incident, has grown even more. So it would be too simplistic, I think, to say that Donald Trump is just appealing to old-fashioned racism. The roots of what happened in Ferguson, I will argue, and the roots more broadly of the racial divide in St. Louis are in metropolitan development and in spatial development. So what happened in Ferguson, which once again set in motion really a national, in some ways international social movement, was not just rooted in old-fashioned racism. The shooting of Michael Brown was the spark. Shooting of Michael Brown by a white police officer in a highly problematic circumstance. But the reason why it had so much energy and so much anger and so much protest is that, as you can see on the bottom of the slide there, suburban fiscal stress drove decades of predatory policing, creating a mass of combustible material that exploded in 2014. We need to understand the background of the Ferguson protests if we're going to understand what's going on. The underlying cause of the turmoil in Ferguson, I argue, was a toxic mix of racial and class or economic inequalities driven by metropolitan development patterns reinforced by local political institutions. Let me say that again. The turmoil in Ferguson is the result of a toxic mix of racial and economic inequalities driven by metropolitan development patterns that are reinforced by local political institutions. So Trump appeals to fears that people have that are based on lived experience. And here's, I think, a very important point for our brothers and sisters in Germany. I think Europeans have a great deal of trouble understanding the huge gaps between different communities in St. Louis in terms of the quality of people's lives and their ability to get ahead. St. Louis is not alone here. Metropolitan areas across the United States have a great deal of economic and racial segregation, communities that are very rich, communities that are very poor. And St. Louis is no different, but it's more extreme. We can talk about why that is. You have a inner city that hasn't changed for 140 years, and you have highly fragmented institutions. But in some ways, if you look at Donald Trump's appeal to the fears of people in suburbs, no wonder people are fearful. When they look at the communities that have schools that are not functioning very well, when they have high rates of crime, social decay, declining property values, even housing abandonment, you might say, no wonder they have fears. Donald Trump is not appealing to racism by itself. He's appealing to fears that are rooted in the real experience of people in metropolitan areas. I will fill out that thesis, hopefully, in this talk. What we're going to do today, just to give you a kind of roadmap of where we're heading, I'm going to talk about place matters, the intersection of race, class, and place in the St. Louis metropolitan area. Then I'm going to talk about justice or fairness. How should place matter? How do these spatial inequalities fit into our theories of justice or fairness in a liberal democratic society, such as the one we live in. Then I'm going to examine the story that is told. The way people justify these inequalities is by telling a story based upon meritocracy, based upon the idea that we deserve the place we live in because of our hard work as individuals and because of the practices of local democracy in the United States. And I'm going to critique that story, right? I'm going to try to show why that story is deeply flawed, but we need to understand that people are telling themselves that story. And finally, I'm not really going to say much about solutions. This is typical of professors, right? They always have detail all the problems, but I'm glad to talk about it in the Q&A. We only have so much time and I want to lay out the problem, and we can talk about solutions perhaps in the Q&A. So let's start with place matters, race, class, and place effects. And I'm going to focus on one area. We could talk about many different areas, but I'm going to focus on one area, which is health. We know in the United States that African Americans have worse health outcomes on a range of issues: high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer, heart disease. This is well documented by public health researchers, that there's a difference between African Americans and whites. What's less well known is the role that place plays in these unequal health outcomes. It's not just about race, it's also about place. So here's the basic geography that we are going to concentrate on today. It's very important that you kind of try to keep this in mind. Once again, the Mississippi River, the border of the city of St. Louis, and the northern suburbs of St. Louis County. Here is a map in which the zip codes that touch upon all areas in the city and county that are over 20% poverty, which is generally where poverty starts to create negative social effects in the literature, and are majority African American. And you'll notice this geography creates a remarkably contiguous area in the city and county. There's not a checkerboard. There's nothing over here. If you had segregation in which there was one area here, one area there, one area here, it would not be quite so severe. We call this in the literature hyper segregation. This is hyper segregated, our region, because all of the poverty and the racial segregation is concentrated, when those two overlap, is concentrated in one part of the region, the eastern part of the city of St. Louis, north of the famous Del Mar Divide, and in North St. Louis County. So if we take a look at the distribution of disease, of certain health outcomes, we find that it overlaps remarkably with this geography. Here's two maps: heart disease mortality rates per 100,000 residents by zip code, right? You will notice that those red areas, which have the highest rates of heart disease, overlap pretty substantially with the area of poverty and race segregation. The same thing can be said of cancer mortality rates. They overlap extremely. This is not just a coincidence, right? This is not just an accident. Something is going on here. More recently, we've become very aware of this geography because of COVID-19. Here are cases of COVID-19 back when we were in the worst part of the pandemic. And by the way, it appears as though we're approaching a similar crisis point, right, in the current period, I'm sad to say. But this is when, back in April, when cases were surging. You can see that the highest rate of COVID cases and COVID deaths we found are located exactly in that geography of racial and economic segregation. So the final one I'm going to show you here is perhaps the most shocking of all. This is life expectancy by zip code. And you can see these two zip codes here, this one here and this one here. There's a 15-year difference in life expectancy, how long you can expect to live if you grow up in this neighborhood compared to, compared to this neighborhood. So you have a 15-year difference in life expectancy, which I think is just shocking and extraordinary, right? To two zip codes that are right next to each other. It's even worse in the area in North City. They are literally a mile or two apart. If I took you on a drive from Wellston to Clayton, we would go from some of the poorest communities in any metropolitan area of the United States to some of the more affluent communities. And it's a huge, huge difference. So the important point to make about these health inequalities is that this is not just an artifact, a result of the fact that poor people and Black people live in a certain part of the region and white people and more affluent people live in another part of the region. In other words, it's not just a result of the individual characteristics of the people who live in this geography. It is, very importantly, a true place effect. If we took a low-income African-American person and moved that person from 63133 to 63107, they would live a longer life, right? Even with the same individual characteristics, the same job, the same income, the same everything. There is a place effect here that is powerful, controlling for race, individual race and individual poverty. So how does place affect health? I'm not going to be able to spend as much time as we could or should on this, but I'll talk about this. I've been in my Place Matters book, we cover this with probably 50 or 100 footnotes to the scholarly literature, right, on how place affects health. Oh, the first one perhaps is pretty obvious. When you live in certain parts of the St. Louis metropolitan area, your access to health services is inferior compared to more privileged parts of the region. You don't have a health clinic nearby. You might not have a hospital nearby. That's pretty obvious. You might not even have a pharmacy nearby, right? You might have to go a long distance. Also, if you live in a segregated neighborhood, you will not, in general, have as good access to healthy food. We talk about what are called food deserts in the United States. These are areas where you cannot get to a full service grocery store without driving a long distance. And for many low-income people, of course, they don't have a car. They are dependent on transit, on buses and walking. And so you'll find that in many neighborhoods in St. Louis that are low income and usually African-American, they don't have access to fresh vegetables. There won't be fresh food available in those stores. They will have to go a long distance to get those fresh vegetables. Access to parks and recreation, exercise. We know that parks are lungs for the city. People need it. And I don't know about you, but during the COVID epidemic, the parks have been absolutely essential for my sanity and my well-being. I go out there and I play tennis and I go for walks. And if I didn't have that, I think I'd be going crazy. And different parts of St. Louis have different access to good parks and good recreation facilities. So that many suburbs, for example, have recreation centers that are really nice. They have swimming pools and gyms and everything. Other suburbs in North County have nothing, have no recreation center. Forest Park, which is located in the center of St. Louis, is a wonderful park. I live not far from Forest Park. The philanthropists have contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to fix up that park. It is a gem. When you go into North City and County, you will not find parks where private philanthropy has raised millions of dollars to fix them up. They are not going to be as nice. They're not going to be as shoddy. And they're going to be shoddy and they're not going to be as safe. The physical environment, lead paint poisoning is often a problem in low-income neighborhoods where older housing was built before we controlled for lead, which is a poison and can affect brain development. Air pollution is a problem. We have problems with environmental justice, with polluting facilities located near low-income and African-American communities. And the interior of homes can have a inferior air quality because of cockroaches and other such issues. The social environment. People have higher degrees of isolation, exposure to risky behaviors. In the case of isolation, what we get in many low-income neighborhoods is extreme turnover, a high eviction rate. People are having to move. Maybe they became unemployed. Maybe they became divorced. And they have no cushion to fall back on, right? They have no money they can use to pay the rent. So they're forced to move. Or the building doesn't meet certain conditions. The landlord is abandoning the building. And that creates this turnover in the community that reduces the social cohesion, reduces the community's ability to defend itself and to collaborate. exposure to risky behaviors. People who live in low-income and minority neighborhoods that are isolated often face risky behaviors, such as smoking, such as drugs, unprotected sex, all of this. And once again, this is not just an individual effect. For example, just to give you one example that I thought was fascinating in the literature, if you know somebody who knows somebody who smokes, your likelihood of being a smoker is statistically higher. In other words, the social network you're in. So if you're in a neighborhood where more people smoke, even though you have the same willpower as somebody who lives somewhere else, the likelihood that you will smoke is higher. And finally, and I can only say a few words about this, but what is called here the weathering effects of stress. This is when you're in a violent environment and there's constant stress, that affects brain development, it affects IQ, it affects your immune system, and it literally gets in the body. So it has a horrible effect on people's quality of life that way. So looking at these tremendous differences in the quality of life and health in different parts of the metropolitan area, why do we put up with this? In a just and fair society, I think most of us on this call would agree, place would not matter in this way, right? Perhaps places would be different in terms of the culture and the aesthetics and the architecture and maybe even the religion of the people who live there, but it would not affect what we call in the Declaration of Independence our inalienable rights, the rights we can't lose, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Obviously, life is affected by this, right? The pursuit of happiness is definitely affected if you're going to have these kinds of place effects on people. So the question becomes, it's really kind of an acute question, why do we in the United States tolerate such blatant inequities and unfair conditions, especially for children, right? Growing up in these neighborhoods. It's not a level playing field, right? So the common explanation, I think, for this would be very straightforward. The cynical explanation would be that people are selfish, right? They only care about themselves. So what does it matter that people over there, have a less high quality of life and health problems? Hey, I don't care. I'm just selfish. Another version of this would be that people are racist, right? White people don't care what happens to black people. Black people are inferior. They're going to have inferior conditions, and we're just going to put up with it. I believe that these two explanations I'm sure there are people who hold these beliefs, right? But I do not think by any means that is the most common belief, especially among, let's be frank, the 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump, if they were all resonating with his language. I think something else is going on. And here's what I want to talk about quickly, which I find so interesting. The idea of fairness, the idea that we think human beings should be treated fairly and equally is hardwired deep into the human brain, excuse me. And that's based upon decades of research in game theory to kind of test, how do people behave? Not what they say, but what do they do in a real situation? And there have been this Ultimatum Game by game theorists has been played in laboratory settings for many decades. It's been played in countries around the world, and the findings are all the same, no matter whether it's Germany, the United States, or you name it, the finding is the same. And here's the way the game works. Group number one, you have two groups, and they're put into different rooms. And you give group number one $1,000, let's say. And you say to group number one, you need to make an offer to group number two on how to split up this $1,000. If group number two accepts your offer, then you both get to keep the money. If group number two rejects your offer, you all get nothing. It's gone, okay? So what happens here? What happens? If you were totally self-interested, if you understood that human beings were totally self-interested and cynical and selfish, what would group number one offer to group number two? You think about it for a second. Well, if group number two is self-interested, we'll offer them, let's say, $50, because 50 bucks is better than nothing, and we'll take 950 bucks. And we know group two will say yes, because 50 bucks is better than $0, right? So of course, if you're selfish, you would offer that. Well, it turns out that the average offer in repeated plays of the Ultimatum Game is between $400 and $500, 40 and 50%, often verging on an even split. And about half of the responders in group two who receive offers below 30% reject the offer. They take $300 and they say, no, I'm not even going to take the $300. Why do they do that? They're trying to send a message to group one that you're not being fair. You're not splitting this up equally. This is unfair. So it turns out the rejections in the Ultimatum Game have been shown to cause adverse physiologic reactions in the human brain when a stingy or small offer is made to group two. Rejections in the Ultimatum Game stimulate parts of the brain in the anterior insular cortex. I'm not a psychologist, so I'm venturing into an area here beyond my expertise, a region associated with visceral disgust. The human brain, when it gets a unfair offer, literally has an immediate reaction of disgust. When group number two receives a fair offer at about 50%, it stimulates pleasure centers in the brain, similar to what we experience when we eat chocolate and we fall in love. So human fairness, this idea that people should be treated equally, is deeply embedded in the human brain. So this raises a puzzling question for us, right? If this is, Professor Swanstrom, if you're correct that people have a deep-seated sense of fairness, then why do they tolerate these tremendous inequalities that seem to be so unfair? So what to say here is that just the fact of these inequalities that I just presented to you is not enough for most people to constitute injustice or fairness. People on the left in the United States and progressives will often express these inequalities. They'll say, look at these inequalities. This is just unfair. And the answer is that kind of presentation can actually, unfortunately, make people even more prone to segregate, right? Because they see how bad things are in the disadvantaged neighborhoods. I mean, who would want to live in a neighborhood if you're going to lose 15 years of your life, right? So just this idea of presenting them is not enough. It all depends on how those spatial inequities came about. Not the fact that they exist, but how they came about. Americans tell a story about race and place that justifies these equities and justifies Donald Trump's project to build walls around suburbs and walls around cities, okay? I hope you're with me. I hope I'm not going too fast, but there's a story here about these inequities that is told. And what I'm going to do is deconstruct the fancy, academic word, but I'm going to criticize this story by talking about facts. And the story, once again, is based upon meritocracy, right? This idea that you get the community you deserve. And here is the origin story of spatial inequality, right? Individual and municipal. It's important that it's both about how individuals behave and how local governments behave, okay? It's not just one, it's both. Most of us, I think, are more familiar with the individual story. But here's the way the story goes. And this is the story that justifies racial and economic inequality in American cities. And as I read, you can follow me on the screen. In the first half of the 20th century, hardworking white families were able to purchase a slice of the American dream, buying their own homes in good neighborhoods in cities. After the passage of fair housing laws in the 1960s, however, low-income and minority households began moving into their neighborhoods, bringing with them crime, social decay, and collapsing property values. Whites fled to suburban municipalities, which fortunately possessed legal tools such as zoning laws, which enabled them to protect their neighborhoods from an influx of undesirable elements that would damage hard-earned property values and undermine middle-class community norms. Local control, good government, and hard work have enabled suburban families to achieve a high quality of life. Donald Trump charges that efforts by the federal government to violate local home rule and open up to suburbs to low-income housing would be a grave injustice to these families that have worked so hard to realize the American dream and to fulfill the American tradition of local democracy. So I'm going to criticize this story, right? When I criticize this story, here's the key. If you focus on the individual, right? Or you focus on the municipality, narrowly on that individual or that municipality, the story is plausible. The story makes sense. The story is true. However, and in many ways, if you think about it, hard work and personal responsibility and good government do produce good results, right? There's no doubt that personal responsibility, staying in school, working hard, saving your money, moving to a good neighborhood, making sure your local government does the right thing, right? All of those are important. However, and I wouldn't deny that, there's no doubt there's a role. There's some truth to this story. There's no doubt there's some truth to this story. I would never deny that personal responsibility and good government don't make a difference. However, when you examine the standard story in the broader context across time and space, in other words, you look at the context historically and you look at the context geographically, it becomes a very different story. The story falls apart. So let's take a quick look at individual meritocracy, and then I'll go to municipal meritocracy. And I'm going to be very quick here with individual because I don't want to go too long here. I want, hopefully, some good questions from you. With regard to individual meritocracy, basically, white households, if you take a look at this, hardworking white families. Well, yes, but here's the problem. In this era, before the civil rights laws, Blacks were discriminating against in housing markets and labor markets. They could not purchase homes in good neighborhoods. They were denied loans by redlining banks and by the federal government. They could not enter certain occupations. Here in St. Louis, my favorite example is in the construction industry. Back in the early 20th century, a Black person could carry bricks, but they could not lay bricks. They could be a brick hotter, but they could not be a bricklayer. So this story has this problem, right? That Black people were not able to acquire the resources to purchase homes. And with regard to income, place also matters. So individual meritocracy at the top, the basic argument is that you work hard, you stay in school, you save your money, right? And then you can buy a home in a nice suburb where you will have a good quality of life. So that's the direction of causality, right? Hard work enables you to live in good neighborhoods. But what if the causality works in reverse? What if where you live determines whether you can succeed in the labor market and accumulate household wealth? Clearly, that is a very, very important part of this. Place determines income at some level, right? So very quickly, once again, a lot of research on this. How is it that where you live determines your income and your household wealth? Well, the most important one is education, right? We all know that education is the key in the modern economy to getting ahead and earning a decent income. And here's where, Leanne and I talked about this a little bit, here's where I think my European colleagues can have at least some frame of reference to talk about this. And Leanne can probably elaborate on this more after I'm finished, but there are neighborhoods in German cities that are occupied by immigrants, by political refugees, and others who tend to be lower income. Those are the Hauptschule, right? And often native Germans would rather have their children go to a gymnasium or another school, which will in general have better outcomes. Even though these schools are all funded the same, there can be a difference this way in schools in Germany with regard to segregation that way. And we can talk more about that after I'm through. But in the United States, not only do we have schools that have extreme poverty, where 100% of the children are low income, we also have unequal funding. schools are funded by the local tax base. So you happen to live in a school district which is poor, your school is not going to have as much resources as other schools. There's also, and I'm going to go very quickly here, there's a spatial mismatch issue, which is to say that if you live in those neighborhoods in North City and County, you're going to be far from many of the jobs. You're not able to move out to live closer to the jobs because of exclusionary zoning and other issues. Job networks. We acquire jobs mostly through word of mouth, through referring you. People who live in these communities of racial and economic segregation have just as many friends as you and I, but it's more likely that their friends are unemployed or do not have connections into the job market the way they would if they lived in a more mixed income or higher income neighborhood. The digital divide, some areas don't have connectivity, and that's obviously crucial in the modern society to apply for jobs even. And the big one is housing value appreciation. And I can't spend too much time here, but basically, African Americans live in neighborhoods where housing has not gone up as much in value. And so they're not able, and that's for historical reasons, they're not able to get on the escalator and increase their household wealth. So let's turn to the second one, which is the municipal meritocracy argument. And this is very much the same. On the top line, we see the conventional story, right? Economically competitive local public policies create a strong fiscal tax base for local governments and lead to high quality local goods and services. But once again, what if the causality works in reverse? And what if location or place determines the quality of public services and the fiscal condition of municipalities? So I compare, this is what's going on in St. Louis, right? I compare the municipalities in North County, and I would include the city of St. Louis in this. They're all running up the down escalator, right? I don't know if you were kids, you would see an escalator and you would try to run up when it was coming down. You had to run very fast just to stay in place. That is the condition that we find ourselves in these municipalities in North County. So the playing field of municipal government and suburban government is not level. St. Louis, the city of St. Louis, is the #1 shrinking city in the world, okay? That's an extraordinary statement. It means that from peak to trough, St. Louis has lost more population than any other city on the face of the globe. That's saying something, right? There might be some small cities somewhere, but basically among all major cities, we are #1, which means that in the city of St. Louis, 90% of people do not live in the city, they live in the suburbs somewhere, right? 90% of the population lives outside the city of St. Louis. Here you can see the population trend. We had 850,000 people in the city of St. Louis in 1950, and we're down now below 300,000. So we also have institutional fragmentation, which means when you take the population out to the suburbs, what you find is very small governments. You can see it there. We're #3 in the nation. The average government's only about 10,000 people, right? A pretty small municipality. And the same things with the average school district. We're #3 in the nation there. So we're highly fragmented. As I said, St. Louis is like other metropolitan areas, only more extreme. We also have these governments engage in exclusionary practices. This is a map that depicts the most exclusionary suburbs are in this orange color. The least exclusionary are in the lighter color. And you can see where all the exclusion is occurring. Mostly this occurs through zoning codes and building codes. It means that in many of these communities, you cannot build multifamily housing. The only type of housing you can build are single family homes on large lots, okay? That's obviously going to prohibit many people who live in North City County from moving to these areas where the jobs are, where the better schools are, where the housing prices are going up in value. If you look at the poverty rate, what's happening in the suburbs, here's Ferguson, right? In 2000, the darker shades are darker shades of concentrated poverty, right? In 2000, there was some concentrated poverty in Ferguson. By 2008, 2012, it has gone out. If we could update this to 2020, we would find much more concentrated poverty in this area. We're moving in the direction toward concentrated poverty in these suburbs. A key dynamic that's going on that affects municipalities and individuals is in the St. Louis metropolitan area. Every year, we produce more houses than there are new households in the region. That means that there is a surplus of housing every year. The inevitable result of this is there has to be housing abandonment. There's no alternative. If you produce more housing than there are households, there's only one result. It's going to have abandoned and vacant housing, right? And the only question is where it's going to be. It's going to be in the older, poorer parts of the region where African Americans have been confined for historical reasons. So the result is abandoned housing. Looks like this, right? And here are the percent vacant units, highest in the same geography. If we could update this to 2020, which I hope to do, we would see that these red areas where 33% of the housing is vacant, right? That's extraordinary. I think the Germans would find that just mind-blowing, right? Has crept out here into North County. It's already starting here, but in 2010. So we have this vacant and abandoned housing, and we have that also low property values. For example, there's a lot of research on vacant and abandoned housing. Let me just read to you one sentence. What is the effect of vacant lots and abandoned housing? Quote, produces violence, higher rates of chronic illness, stunted brain and physical development in children, mass retreat into unhealthy eating and exercise habits, and breakdown of social networks. All of that, once again, can be demonstrated independent of the characteristics of the individuals in that neighborhood, right? Abandoned housing produces that. So the tax base in the city, because of these property values, here is the per capita property tax base per municipality. The city of St. Louis, I think, would probably be an orange here. It all depends how you look at it. But here are the suburbs, right? All in North County. They have a tax base per capita that is 1/10 of the more affluent areas, in some cases 1/15. So it's many, many times difference in this. So what this has created is, in the case of Ferguson, getting back to Ferguson and the demonstrations that occurred and the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that. Sure.
Can you go back to the map and just point where UMSL is located?
UMSL is located right about here. There is I-70, right? We're just south of I-70, so we're right in there. There might be one little suburb there, right, with high, we know what that is, probably Belnor, something like that, right? But other than that, we're in a pretty poor area. Good, thank you, Leanne. So Ferguson, in 2014, Ferguson faced a fiscal dilemma because of what I just talked about, right? Because the property tax base and the sales tax base were declining. And when you're in a municipality with declining revenues and declining tax base, what can you do? You can raise tax rates over here, right? But the problem with that is that will further reduce property values, because if you're going to buy a home and you have to pay high property tax rates, you're going to pay less for that home, right? It will push down housing values. If you go the other direction and you keep tax rates the same, public services and schools are going to deteriorate, right? You're in a dilemma. Either way you go is bad. So what did they decide to do? What's the solution in Ferguson? The solution was traffic fines and court fees. In 2013, the year before Michael Brown was shot, there were 32,975 arrest warrants for nonviolent offenses by the city of Ferguson police. That's extraordinary, right? A city of no more than about 20,000 people had issued 32,975 arrest warrants for people for nonviolent offenses, like a broken taillight, like speeding, like anything with regard to traffic. It represented 17% of general revenue in 2014. Revenues from fines and court fees increased 44% from 2011 to 2014, the year that Michael Brown was shot. And here's a quote that says that the city was putting pressure on the police to write more tickets. Unless ticket writing ramps up significantly before the end of the year, it will be hard to significantly raise collections next year, given that we are looking at substantial sales tax shortfall. It's not an insignificant issue. In other words, write more tickets. Well, telling poorly trained, underpaid police officers who are overwhelmingly white to write as many tickets as possible in a community that is majority Black is inviting problems, is a volatile situation. Racial bias undoubtedly played a role in those interactions between police and the citizens. But if you take a look at other cities that were led by African-American mayors, had African-American chiefs of police, and had African-American police, they behaved the same way. because of these fiscal pressures. So it wasn't just race. So the shooting of Michael Brown, as tragic as it was just the spark that ignited the protest and demonstrations in St. Louis that spread across the nation and the world. So let me come to a conclusion here. I've come to the end of my time. Old-fashioned racism, my thesis is bias against people because of the color of their skin is alive and well. Don't get me wrong. But I do not think it is the main mechanism reinforcing racial inequities in the United States today. It has been replaced by a story based on place and the idea that personal merit and local democracy justify unequal racial outcomes. So let me very quickly do a little thought experiment with everybody on this call, especially the Americans, but the Germans can participate. Imagine in the St. Louis metropolitan area that low-income and African-American people were distributed across the landscape in a random fashion. Every community was just like every other community, okay? Get that in your head, right? No segregation. Everything's just sort of random. Okay. Then imagine that Black people always had to go to inferior medical services. Black people had to go to grocery stores that charged more and didn't have fresh vegetables. Black people suffered more from air pollution. We would think that this was incredibly odd. We would think that it was wrong, right? Place justifies these racial inequities. In St. Louis, local institutional boundaries, municipalities and school districts, are superimposed on top of racial and economic segregation, making Trump's case for building a wall around suburbs convincing to many people. No wonder people want to build a wall, right? They're worried about what it's like over there, right? To achieve racial justice is not enough to address people's racial attitudes and beliefs. We need to change the lived experience of people in cities and suburbs. We need to build and through hard work, create successful, racially diverse, mixed income, successful communities. Let me end there, and I would like to open it up for any questions you might have or comments. We welcome criticisms.
Thank you so much, Todd. You said you wouldn't give any solutions, but at least you have given a strong statement on what needs to be done. I think we have our first question here in the Q&A line. Can you see it there? So it says, given the disparities and hyper segregation in metropolitan St. Louis, what is the role, if any, of the state legislature or the federal government?
Yes, this is a really good question. Let me start with the federal government. I'm going to be critical of the Democratic Party here, okay? Because I believe the federal government has not adequately raised up this issue or addressed the issue. For the most part, the federal government, under the leadership of the Democratic Party, when the Democratic Party has controlled the presidency and both houses of Congress, they have not robustly and vigorously attacked the issues that I pointed out here. The reason why is very simple. They believe and fear a backlash by suburban voters. What Democratic politicians have usually said is they are against discrimination. Of course I'm against. We're going to end discrimination. And so, for example, we're going to enforce the civil rights laws. And we're going to go against anybody who discriminates somebody because of their race, right? And I'm all in favor of that. Good for them. And in fact, in the case of Ferguson, you know, the Justice Department came in and showed that the city of Ferguson had violated civil rights laws. And the city of Ferguson its police were engaging, for example, in searches of vehicles which violated the Fourth Amendment guarantee in the United States to unreasonable search and seizures. You can't just search somebody's car unless you have a reason. And the Ferguson police were doing that, usually against Black people, by the way. It was biased. And the federal government came in and said, you can't do that, and we're going to force you to give up that practice. And so they negotiated a consent decree with the city of Ferguson. So all of this is great. And the consent decree, by the way, had, I think, something like about 200 different things that the city of Ferguson was supposed to do, right? Including community policing. Have the police go in and work with the community, get to know the teenagers. Darren Wilson would never have shot Michael Brown if he knew him as a person, as a human being, right? So the federal government is telling the city of Ferguson to clean up its act and to address these issues. Here's the problem. They didn't give them a penny to do this. And to do community policing, to train the police, to hire more Black police officers, to make sure these officers are well-trained and well-educated, all that takes money. And the federal government didn't give them a penny, didn't give them a pfennig, right, to do any of this work. And therefore, I feel like while Joseph Biden, did not play the game of we're going to build a wall. And Biden's response to Donald Trump, when Donald Trump said he's going to protect suburbs against low-income housing and protect suburbs against the AFFH rule, Biden's response was, Donald Trump does not understand that the suburbs are much more diverse than he's portraying them, as if they are white, upper class, enclaves. Biden said that in many suburbs, white and Black parents are sharing rides to take their kids to soccer practice. Now, this is true. This is true in many middle-income suburbs. It's not true in the poverty suburbs that I talked about, right? And for the Democratic Party and the federal government to do something about this, they would need to vigorously address this issue. And they have not, the spatial issue, the institutional issue, the fact that governments and school districts do not have the resources and are not able to develop themselves, right? So that in the case of the federal government, I'm disappointed to say, things have gotten worse during the Obama administration. This suburban segregation increased, it did not decrease. The Obama administration's AFFH, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, was a good program. And I applaud it because it was asking metropolitan areas to examine their practices. The problem with it, it didn't have any teeth. It didn't have any money behind it, right? And if we're going to do something about this, we need to go further. So with regard to state governments, and I don't want to, you have to watch out what questions you ask a professor. He could go on forever. And Leanne, you can follow up. But with regard to states, the state of Missouri does very little, if anything, to address this issue. In fact, the state did pass a law which limited how much municipalities can use traffic fines and court fees to finance their budgets. And that was good because that reduced this predatory policing I talked about, right? But these municipalities are still under fiscal pressure. And at some point, they're going to turn to this once again if you don't watch them at every turn, because they need the money, right? They need revenue. And the state of Missouri refuses to do anything in terms of revenue sharing. It does not fully fund the educational formula, which would level the playing field of schools. And so I would say that in the state of Missouri, it's probably even more pessimistic in terms of them doing something about this, but we would need both of them to step to the plate and create a level playing field. Let me stop with that.
That basically, Todd, answers the question of our friend Nadia from Stuttgart here, who has asked the question, I'm sure you saw it, what can local politics in St. Louis do and change? We got another question tying in with this.
Leanne, let me say a few words about that because
Sure.
I think my answer sounded too pessimistic, right? It sounded like, the state and federal governments are not doing their job to address this issue, which I believe is true. At the local level, we are seeing lots of very positive development, and that's what I've been working with in my Desley professorship, right? Without adequate government support, nonprofits and local governments and foundations and corporations are working to lift up these neighborhoods that have these problems and these issues. And so there's lots of good work happening. And here's what's happening in American cities. Young people do not want to flee to white suburbs, right? And live in some boring suburb in a single family home with no bars and restaurants close by. They want to live in an exciting, pedestrian friendly, mixed use neighborhood that, by the way, is racially diverse. The other good news here is that young people are not nearly as racist or fearful as the older generation. The older generation experienced what I talked about. No wonder their neighborhoods went downhill when they integrated. Oh my God, no wonder they're afraid of Black people, right? They had real experiences here. Young people, they didn't experience this, right? Many suburbs now do have some racial diversity. So if you look at St. Louis suburbs, you will find African Americans in almost every suburb. Very small percentage in many, but still, it's more diversity than there was. And these are usually, by the way, middle class, professional African Americans, not poor African Americans. So the younger generation wants to move into cities. They're moving into cities, and this is the issue of gentrification, right? That Leanne mentioned, I had researched. But what it is, it's creating some opportunities to create some successful, diverse, economically and racially diverse neighborhoods that are working. And in the city of St. Louis, we have them. The most diverse neighborhoods are located in the central corridor in the near south side, where young people are moving in. Housing prices are going up, but at least for now, there hasn't been a great deal of displacement. And we have these more diverse areas, and we're working on policies where the people who live there, low income and minority households, can stay in the neighborhood as it revives. So we're getting revival at the local level. So I wanted to say that there are some positive trends here, Leanne, that are counteracting all of these unfortunate facts I talked about.
Thank you, Todd. So if you scroll down the questions here, and I'm so to all our participants, apologies that I don't go one by one, but just tying in with what Todd just said. So a comment and a question from Rod here says, isn't part of the problem that no one wants to raise taxes, state or federal, and that is why we lack the resources needed to tackle the underlying place problems you identified? I would agree with that question, and I'm glad, Rod, you asked that, because that's something that, as a more recent immigrant to the United States, I'm still baffled how little readiness is there on either side of the political spectrum to raise taxes. That's the one thing I hate to put my host nation here on the spot for being a little frugal when it goes to taxes and to share things as opposed to thinking of their own wallet first. And I'm not claiming we wouldn't do that in Germany, but the extent and the scope is a little different and the scale is different in the United States. I would claim that part for sure.
Well, Leanne, this is a very intelligent question, because I think this feeds into the problem that I talked about at a very powerful level. Ever since the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, in his first inaugural address, Ronald Reagan famously said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. So we've had 40 years of attacks on government, right? This idea that government takes away your freedom. Government undermines community. Government pushes aside volunteer efforts and efforts to address issues at the local level. So I think that has really damaged our ability to address these issues. Because after all, if we had in the city, part of it has to do with the way we organize government at the local level in St. Louis. If we had one regional government, right, one school district in the city and county, and some metropolitan areas of the United States have this, that means that every school would get exactly the same amount of funding. It means that every citizen would get exactly the same amount of money spent on parks, spent on social public services. You wouldn't be able to have a public sector where some people get excellent local public services at a very low tax rate, and other people are forced to pay a very high tax rate to get inferior services. Mm-hmm. So by the way, with regard to this anti-government rhetoric, if you go out to these suburbs in West County, you will find they raise a fair amount of tax revenue because they want to have excellent schools. Now they have a good tax base, so it's not so burdensome, but they don't have small government. They have really, really pretty well-funded government. They go to the in Clayton, you can go to the recreation center. I lived in University City, and Clayton is a very affluent suburb. They have a recreation center that looks like a private, country club,
I'm very
right?
familiar with that rec center.
2 swimming pools and, wonderful, everything. And I basically would pay a fee to go there because it was such an excellent, and I liked the whirlpool, and I liked the workout room and everything. It's gorgeous. So in other words, they're not anti-government at the local level, but it's almost like government in St. Louis is not government. It's almost like a private club. Because if you can afford to buy a home in Clayton, you get the benefits of the club. So it's almost like it's not government. The idea of government is we all share the same things, right? We have public goods and public services. The word public means things that are shared. But in St. Louis, local government is not shared. It's privatized. You move about in the region, and if you have income and wealth, you can purchase better government, right? And so that undermines this idea. And yeah.
Sorry for cutting in.
No, do it, please.
But one last question regarding tax money in general. And I don't want to hijack all the conversation here since I had like 10 or so pre-submitted questions also for people who cannot use Zoom but use our YouTube link and who are highly interested in this topic. And then we have more questions in the Q&A box. But the one thing I wanted to ask last and really short is when people think about tax raises, and that is my personal view. It still comes a little bit as a surprise to me as a non-American, as a German still here, that people have their own personal taxes in focus. The European perspective would be what's the taxes that the corporations pay. So it's more the taxes, the tax system per se, and the corporations, and that is very different balance. If you wanted to compare that to I don't always want to pull the European example here into the spotlight. Also, if you look at other developed nations and you see the percentage of tax paid by corporations and that income versus tax for the personal tax, like the private taxpayer. So I just wanted to toss that out there, and then maybe we would just we would go down the Q&A list here before I go to the pre-submitted questions. 1 second. So Miriam, our professor from UMSL, is asking, what roles do schools and educators need to play to address spatial racism? How do envision a school community partnership that addresses these injustices?
That's a very good question. And really, as the first answer to that question, I would say that housing and community development policy is educational policy in the United States. In other words, what our schools look like depends upon how our communities are developed. And unfortunately, we have not just racial and economic segregation, we have racial and economic segregation encased in institutional boundaries, which makes it all that much more invidious or harmful to the performance of the schools, right? So given those facts, however, what do we do, right? How do we address this? We have an excellent example in St. Louis where Beyond Housing has formed a partnership with a school district, by the way, that is 100% low income. What we say in the United States, free and reduced lunch. And they have a very strong partnership with the schools where they try to provide supplemental services for the students, because in low income communities, the schools have to do more than just teach, right? They might have to deal with health issues. So for example, they put nurses and medical care facilities in the school, right? So the kids can get their vaccinations and get to address these issues. I think that, you need to have role models in the schools. Research has shown, I'm not an educational. At this point, we're moving into the school of education, right? Given you have a school that is segregated, low income, and perhaps mostly minority or Latinx, a lot of kids speaking English as a second language, then there are a bunch of things you can do. And we should do those things, right? We should hire African-American teachers to be role models for the kids, because the research is clear. If they have a role model who looks like them, they do better in school, right? We need to do whatever we can to stabilize the classroom, which means we need programs, and Beyond Housing is working on this, to stabilize the community. Because if kids are moving every 3 months and they move in and out of the classroom, the teacher cannot teach. I've done the research on this, and I've seen the research, right? You can't teach if kids are moving in and out of the classroom every few months, right? And you really, it's a huge problem in these schools. So how do you address that problem? Well, you're going to have to go into the community and perhaps have anti-eviction programs that reduce the number of legal evictions. Perhaps provide people with a individual savings account over here that if they're short of rent 1 month, they can draw upon that, right? And so what I would say, once again, I'm not going to speak to, and we have a lot of smart people at UMSL in the School of Education that can address how the curriculum and the teachers and the administrators can address these issues inside the school building. I'm going to talk about what happens outside the school building. And we need to address what happens outside the building. We need stable communities. Ideally, what we need is if we had more economically balanced schools in St. Louis, we would have improved educational performance across the board. No one would be damaged so long as you don't overburden a school with too much poverty and too many households that are having structural issues, right? And I'm not saying that poor people are somehow bad people, but they have issues, right? They have to move if they can't meet the rent. But if we could create more economically balanced schools, everybody would be better off. We would show better performance in education, and the excellent schools would do no worse. The literature is clear. And other metropolitan areas around the United States have begun to do this. Charlotte, North Carolina has one big school district, right? Charlotte, Mecklenburg. It's as if we had one district for the city and county, and they pursued economic integration and they saw improvements in test scores. So it can be done.
That was my, actually, before I turn to more questions here in the Q&A box, I got several pre-submitted questions here that were, and I'll summarize it for the sake of time so that we can get to our Q&A box better. There were several questions asking, where is St. Louis in terms of the spatial divide in comparison to other American cities? So because, and I found those questions interesting. So we had like several asking for the spatial divide in terms of immigrants versus traditionally Black communities, and several others. But if you could just hit a little bit on that, Todd, if you can speak to that and say, where are we in comparison to other places? Because frankly speaking, when I first arrived here 8 years ago, I had, like, prior to moving here, I hadn't seen much of the United States other than the East and the West coasts and the bigger cities there. And I remember that for the first 6 months, and pardon our American audiences here, but I felt like somebody has taken me time travel. I felt like this is color purple to me. This is, and you said earlier on your slides, you said Black people had to go to different schools, had to go to different grocery schools. I feel like, is it had? Is it past tense? To me, that is not entirely past tense because of the spatial divide we still have. I mean, they have the option to, well, drive across town and go to different grocery stores, but you and I know that the same Schnucks or Walmart, the same chain doesn't offer the same products in North County versus in the more affluent areas. So where is the comparison? Where are we?
Sure. Well, no, I didn't mean to suggest it was past. It's present. These spatial inequalities exist right now, and they are a problem. So how does St. Louis compare to other metropolitan areas? The answer is we're one of the most racially segregated metropolitan areas in the country. We've seen since the passage of the civil rights laws, racial segregation has gone down, but at a slow rate. Economic segregation, on the other hand, has gone up at a fairly rapid rate. So that's what's happening. And, St. Louis is among the tops in the country. I think a major reason why St. Louis is so racially segregated is because we don't have what many other metropolitan areas have, and you refer to this, Leanne. We don't have the immigration, which creates a more complex racial mix. In metropolitan areas on the two coasts, and other parts of the country, you have a great deal of Asian and Latino and Mexican and Caribbean and other immigration, which creates a much more complex racial picture. Here in St. Louis, it's often a dichotomy, black and white, right? Because we're located right in the middle of the country, so we tend to have less immigration than other areas. Now, we do have some immigration, and it's increasing, by the way, pretty rapidly, right? It's going up rapidly from a very low level. And, I think we've certainly the Bosnian immigrants who moved in here, now they're largely white, right? They look like St. Louisans often. So they've integrated pretty well, moved out of the suburbs, succeeded, and to a great extent, although there's some issues. It's once again comes down to skin color, right? Immigrants that are of a darker skin have more trouble integrating. So St. Louis is, a segregated area relative to other areas. And I think our institutional structure, makes it exaggerates the segregation, right? Because you can move into a school district or a municipality to improve your prospects. In other metropolitan areas, you don't have nearly that kind of fragmentation, so you don't tend to have that segregation, that reinforcement of segregation.
Thank you, Todd. So here's a question that Helena Sherman is asking. Among the many challenges to personal and government issues affecting low-income areas, which would be those or perhaps top 3 to tackle first, is it possible to isolate some issues to focus on before others?
Boy, I know Helena. She
I like that question.
That's a good question. This is a tough question. I think I told her to ask tough questions in an email exchange, and now she did it, unfortunately. Well, in terms of the community development work I do, I think one of the most important things we can do is stabilize communities. If people have a stable situation, even if they're poor, even if they have perhaps not the best access to jobs and education, if they have a stable setting, they can create organizations, they can create collaborations, they can generate political power, they can begin to defend themselves, right? So I think stability is extremely important. And the community development we work with, the community development groups we work with often are quite effective, even in neighborhoods that are really in rough shape, right? If they can create a community garden, where somebody can get together, and that can help. I'm not saying this is the solution to the problems, don't get me wrong, but in terms of limited resources. So one of the assumptions behind Helene's question is, if we had all the money in the world, I'd tell you what we would do, right? But given limited resources, what do we do at the local level? And I would say the other thing we need to do is invest in those neighborhoods that are on the verge of having problems, right? What I call middle neighborhoods. If we can, at a relatively small expenditure, stabilize those neighborhoods and make sure we don't lose that housing, we don't tear down that good housing, right? As a region, as a city, I think we can really make a difference. And that's given the limited resources. Unfortunately, that means that the very low income neighborhoods, what do we do about them? Well, we're probably not going to turn them around in the next few years because the market is so weak and you're having a loss of population. What we can do, as I said, is try to provide services, try to work with what we've got there, a lot of vacant land. Maybe we can turn that into community gardens. Maybe we can turn that into parks. Maybe we can help stabilize the community and invest in social services because people are going to live in these left behind neighborhoods. And we need to have programs for them, but we're not going to turn them around in the short run. And I'm afraid we make the mistake often of thinking if we build some new housing in a very poor neighborhood in North City or county that we can turn around that community. The answer is no. And in fact, building more housing may actually make the situation worse because they already have an oversupply of housing, right? And it's just going to lead to abandonment and vacancies somewhere else.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. So I'm going to pick up a comment here from Christa Wolf or Christa Wolf. Sounds German, I don't know. But anyway, so very good comment. People don't question the taxes that are wasted on the military industrial establishment, but they're reluctant to pay for healthcare and education. So I'll just leave this out there, and I read it out for everybody who hasn't gotten to the Q&A box here. And then I'd like to pick up one other question here in the chat box again from Miriam, who's from our College of Education, also part of the DESLI collaborative, that we might have a word or two on like in a second. But I would like to tie Miriam's question in with one of the pre-submitted ones here. So Miriam is asking, what are the most gentrified areas in St. Louis, and what are the consequences of the gentrification in these areas? The question that got pre-submitted to me was, and that might be actually our last one, given the time here and a few announcements I still have to make. The question here was, so for people new to the United States who are house hunting, there are all these fancy tools out there. For example, Zillow and other real estate tools. And for non-Americans who are first here and who try to find a house, it is amazing, amazing how much information you get about your target, not just about house prices and house details, but about your target communities. It starts from you know that, and everybody who lives here in St. Louis or elsewhere in the United States is familiar with that. You can Google the public schools, the scores of the public schools. You can Google the, not Google, but use that tool, that Zillow tool or other tools to find out what's the average educational degree of your neighborhood, what's the median income, what's the ethnicity diversity from basically broken down from Caucasian over Black and Hispanic to everything. I think it's like 5 or 10 different categories. So that ties in with Miriam's question. So what are the consequences of that gentrification? I have never seen such a tool elsewhere, maybe due to lack of information, but I personally haven't. And the person who asked that question here is basically asking what justifies those tools legally.
Should I try to address some of these questions, Leanne, in a couple minutes here? Okay, just give me a couple minutes because I know we are going to come to an end soon. Boy, these are big questions, but you know, I think it's very interesting. The comment about Zillow is extremely interesting. As you point out, Leanne, this huge amount of information that Americans have access to when they're choosing where to live. And the answer is, hey, it makes a big deal of difference. Neighborhoods are changing all the time. You better make sure you buy a home or rent an apartment in the right neighborhood, because you might find out that the neighborhood suddenly is going to go downhill and you're going to be experiencing crime and drug gangs and other such things. So no wonder Americans. And that's what it means is communities have become items of consumption. Where you live is part of the capitalist marketplace of consumption. I would say in Europe, well, of course I live in, in this community, and, it's not really, I'm not really making a decision to move here or there because it will change the prospects of my life. Sure, you might, be closer to your job or whatever. But in the United States, that question is loaded. It is loaded, folks, because our neighborhoods are so fragmented, because there's so much inequality and such a difference in the quality of life and the health of people where they live. No wonder they are resonating with all of this information, and they're responding to people's desires to know what's happening. Unfortunately, what happens, is that in the United States, the number of neighborhoods where you can feel really secure in, even in the suburbs, is going down, because more and more the middle suburbs, those that are just, an okay mix of middle and working class families and everything, they're disappearing. I've done the numbers on this recently. Suburbs are falling into very affluent suburbs and very poor suburbs. As a result, to get into a totally stable suburb with really, really good schools has become more and more expensive over time. So when Donald Trump was appealing to are going to protect your American dream, I'm sure a lot of people's response was, boy, I'm in the suburbs, but I'm struggling. I'm struggling. I'm paying a lot for my house. The schools have problems. It's not just nirvana. And with regard to gentrification, and I know we have to end here, Leanne, but I just published an article comparing a German city, Dortmund, to St. Louis in terms of gentrification. But we concluded, my co-author, Jörg Plurger, and I, that gentrification in older industrial cities like St. Louis and Dortmund, whether in Germany or in the United States, looks not like gentrification in New York or Berlin or Munich, right? It's not this hot phenomenon that comes in and totally turns over a neighborhood. Rather, it occurs slowly. It generates some upward pressure on rents, but not nearly as much. And the other thing is it varies. In one place over here, you actually have more African-American population in a gentrified neighborhood. Over here, you have a decline in African-American population. So it's quite variable. So my conclusion, and I can't go into the details now, I wish I could eliminate the word gentrification, because the word gentrification is covering over tremendously different neighborhood processes. And I think it's simplistic and misleading to use one word to describe a very complex phenomenon.
Thank you so much, Todd. And I think that is a very good last line for today. For this coverage, I think we have, this is the first time I actually still have like 10 or 12 questions pre-submitted, and that shows how much interest is there and how much need is there to discuss these things. Also, I wanted to inform everybody who is still here or who will be watching our recording then, that we're hoping and planning in the future to bring our students and younger audiences together for open discussions, maybe sometime next year following this, those 4 sessions that we have lined up for this fall. And we do have some interest from our German side and partners to reciprocate, to maybe feature some of their race and racism issues and provide their presentation while we're taking part. So Todd, your presentation today with the spatial divide tied super well in with what we have listened to before, like with Matt Taylor starting out on identity questions and with his background in psychology. Last time, our last event was about education and schools, and it was a great preparation for what you covered today. So before we conclude here, and before I announce our next presenters for the month of December, I'd like to pick up something that my Stuttgart friends just put here in the chat box. Maybe Bob, you can use that link and put it in the either in the chat box or in the Q&A for everybody. So during the 11th and the 13th of November, there will be a showing, a viewing of the movie For Akeem. So some people here in St. Louis might be familiar with this movie that features the life of a Black American young student, which is a phenomenal movie, and that was actually in cooperation and collaboration with our police department. Our Stuttgart team that is here today and I visited with the St. Louis Police Department about a year, earlier this year, I'd say, and talked about this. And then the link that Bob has just put here in the chat box is the day when we have the opportunity to chat with the producers of the movie. So that is open, that's an open event to everybody, and that definitely comes with an invitation to our St. Louis audience here as well. So thank you, Nadia, and everybody for highlighting that again. And then our next coverage is on Thursday, the 3rd of December, same time like today. And it will, and we will host Dr. Tanisha Stevens, the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Missouri St. Louis. And she and her, maybe 1 or 2 of her team members will talk about the important role of such an office And it was very helpful for like today, Todd, to see our like on the map of St. Louis and our cosmopolitan Greater St. Louis area here, to see where are we at and why is it so important for us to be that anchor institution to the community with the Des Lee Collaborative reaching out, which today we're running out of time, but maybe in the next discussion we can highlight that a little bit, or in one of the coming discussions, to really showcase what is UMSL doing here and how important are we in that regard, to not just offer great education for everybody, but also for making a difference in the community and to where we are, and to not just have this one little green spot that we all saw, or some where we have a little pocket, but to make that green greener and bigger. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Todd, for this wonderful coverage. It's a tough topic. It's I'm always nervous about before we go into those webinars, because they are so it's still very hard boiling for me, not just like heart wrenching. It's a topic where you feel like when you're here, we ought to do something, and it has to start with individual people to have our communities less segregated, talk to each other more, have more natural opportunity to mix and mingle, and to have walkable communities that provides that connection, before we all start about talking about the bigger picture of like house prices and tax, which is of course a desirable thing to go to be, but it starts with our actions every single day. That is my personal view. So in that regard, thank you, everybody. Thanks for everybody participating and listening to us, and participating in the